is the start of Norway, the people. And then the fjords, lands and life, that's about how Norway was created, but it's also about modern Norway, it's about the people. It's sprinkled with my own personal experiences from Norway, because I have been 1 or 2 times. And then the third one is, who is Norway's greatest polar explorer? You've all heard of Amundsen. Well, you might think he is, but I shall be offering you 4 explorers to intrigue you. And then the 4th one is about World War II, and it's about Norwegian resistance and collaboration that went on in World War II. So we better get on with the Vikings, haven't we? You know, and I guess some of you saw those wildlife pictures of mine that I had on the screen beforehand. Well, I like to think that the Vikings would see those as well. It's a link between us and them. I'm also going to do some myth busting today. And this is the very first myth I'm going to bust about the Vikings. Because you think you know about them, you've seen them on TV, on films, but the chances are you don't really. Historians tell us that lady Viking warriors didn't exist. But some ladies did travel with them on their journeys. And in the sagas, they're called shield maidens. Now, I'm married to a Norwegian, so I have my own shield maiden. Yes, you get the message. Historians also actually define the Viking Age, and they define it as when the Danish Vikings attacked the abbey at Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. They stole the magnificent church treasures, destroyed the monastery, and killed those who fought back, took the rest as slaves. And it ended when Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Now, that's not the Viking Age. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. So I call it the Viking Age of discovery and adventure. They're just like us, off to see things. Now, unfortunately, the only Viking history written is these runestones, and each of these tells a story of great warrior deeds. But they didn't write down their own history. Can you imagine chiselling on a stone, writing down the history? It's just not possible. We do have the Icelandic sagas, which were written 300 years later, using memories that have been passed down, and many of their victims left written records. So we have a history that's either old or biased, but we also have archaeological and DNA evidence as well. And I'm sure many of you are related to Norwegians. They didn't just appear from nowhere, and you need to go back 20,000 years to the very last ice age. And as the glaciers receded northwards, the hunter-gatherers who were down below moved north. And here they experienced the farming age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, just like the rest. And for many years the pagan Vikings grew in strength, and there they created their own culture. Their ideology centred on the cosmological tree, Yggdrasil. That's the tree of Odin. There are 7 worlds, but we're only going to talk about 2. There's Central Midgard, and that's where the Vikings themselves lived, Earth as we know it. And then at the top is Asgard, and that's the home of the gods. And all the Viking warriors wanted to end up there. But there was only one way to get there. You had to die in battle. And the rainbow you can see going up, that's called the Bifrost Bridge. Be careful how I say that. And it has its origins, we think, in the Northern Lights. Now Odin was the god of kings, but it was Thor with his mighty hammer, gloves of steel, belt of strength. He was the god that all the warriors wanted to be like. He had a huge reputation. He was the Viking superhero. Now, by 1350 BC, before Christ, the Vikings lived in the white areas that you can see on the map. And the characteristics of the land was to create three nations. But archaeological evidence leads us to believe that those three could transfer ideas between themselves. And the Swedish part of Scandinavia was flat and easy to farm. Proof that a complex society could be found at a place called Borum Eshoj. That's where there are these huge and numerous burial mounds which could only have been created by a society. These people also developed the famous longships. They were the key to the Vikings' success. On the Swedish island of Gotland, there are these ship-shaped monuments that look like longships. Denmark was also flat, and that was productive, and they developed larger farms. And so both Denmark and Sweden's population growth was driven by the agriculture, and it led them to become kingdoms. But Norway was different. Its fjords and mountains fragmented the land. Unification was much delayed. The Hultspring boat, which is on display in Copenhagen, provides us with the key piece of evidence. It was buried in 350 BC, and inside it, it was full of weapons. And so we know the Vikings were developing art of war amongst themselves. Another significant event occurred in 9 AD, and that was when the North German tribes defeated a huge Roman army. Rome invaded Britain in 55 BC, and Christianity followed there soon after. But for the Vikings, it would arrive 800 years later because it was stopped there. There is evidence that the Vikings traded with the Romans as early as 40 AD. These fantastic solid silver Roman drinking cups were found at the Hoby burial hoard on the Danish island of Lolland. The Romans loved amber, and there is loads of amber in the Baltic, and my guess is that's what they used to buy them. Now it's the lack of Christianity that explains the difference between Vikings and the rest of Europe. Santa Claus is a Christian concept, and the Vikings would consider giving a weakness, not a strength. We don't know what they call themselves. The Irish called them Ostmen, people from the east. We knew them as Norsemen in Britain, people from the north. We call them Vikings, but the word Vik, that describes where they lived, a creek, an inlet, or a small bay. And the word Viking in their language means to go on a raid, to go Viking, but it is a lovely name. They were just people trying to survive. I bet we all think of them as raiders, but there was so much more to them. They were merchants, settlers, explorers, founders, in that order. And in fact, raiding was only a very small part of their life. Every Viking had a profession. They were farmers, fishermen, hunters, gatherers, and merchants in that order. Their culture honoured the work they did, and they were skilled at all of those jobs. There was a clearly defined social class. Right at the bottom were the slaves, who were known as thralls. And next came the free men. They're the working class. The farmers and craftsmen were called jarls. They were the aristocracy. And at the top were the warriors, with the strongest of them all being the king. That was key. The kings of Norway lived in these huge longhouses, like this one, shown here at Borg. And that's near to where one of the ports we're going, and it is the largest one known. That one belonged to a very powerful local chief. It's 85 metres long, and it's believed about 1,800 people were in it or around it. Every longhouse generally consisted of a living area, a ceremony hall, and somewhere for the animals to be stabled. It'd be warm, but quite smoky. There is no equality in Viking culture. Some females were sorceresses because magic had feminine qualities. Gender roles were clearly defined, with marriage proposals being made by men to the daughter's family. She had no say in who she was to marry. And her job was to look after the house and the farm, although the men did do lots of farm work. And the Viking belief was very simple. If you did a good job, then you were held in high esteem. Now, men could have extramarital affairs. Ladies couldn't. But generally the mistress lived in the house under the control of the wife. And another thing was that divorce could be initiated by either of you. And if you were struck 3 times by your husband, that was grounds for divorce. And the divorce settlements were pretty good. It was Viking law that the man carry his sword with him. The ladies were not allowed to touch them, and they were not allowed to vote. Only men had the vote. Remember, this is a long time ago. And finally, after all this time, we've reached the point where the Viking adventures start. And I'm going to use a map like this to show you their progress every 100 years. We're talking about a long time span. And so I'm using different colours for each century. So brown is where we start from. And the Swedish have travelled as far as a place called Staraya Ladoga. It's 70 miles west of St. Petersburg, and these burial mounds on the left there that you can see, they have been identified as Viking. The locals there called them Russ, rowers of boats. That's the origins of the term Russia. By the end of the century, they travelled down the rivers in their lovely ships, and they got as far as Constantinople or Istanbul. Here, they discovered slaves were really valuable with silver. It was 12 ounces of silver for a man and 8 ounces for a woman. That was more money than any Viking could earn in a lifetime of farming. No wonder they turned to them. We don't know why they set out to conquer the world. There's just a few theories. Perhaps they had outgrown their land and they needed to expand. Perhaps they just wanted some adventure like us. But what is clear is that they had the ships, the sailing skills and navigation skills, a wish to trade, and also the ability to impose their will on the weaker people. Now, as winter ended in the homeland, first the Viking warriors helped plant the crops. And then they would leave
lunch
the
or
family to work the farm.
2
And he
salads.
would go raiding or trading.
Súp là nó có
His
súp gì
intention
nữa.
would be to
Soup.
return home with his bounty
Two soup
in time to do the harvest.
and one fish
Ships were key to their success.
and
they had a
không
few
còn
different
không
types.
ăn gì fish
But
and
the
fish
building
em ăn gì
Có cái
process
gì
was the
gọi là
same
có
for
cái gì?
everyone.
thì nói
Mà cái menu mình có
Every
cái gì
vessel
mình mới
was
biết
built
được
trời
chứ.
nói như hết rồi nói đại
Starting with a solid keel
ăn như thường một lần đó
water's edge.
một lần đó
They didn't have a production line like this. This is just a portrayal
What do you
of the
have
different
for lunch?
stages of the boat.
The
build.
main entree?
And as soon as the main hull was able to go in the water,
Oh,
they floated.
that's okay.
And they
That's okay.
finished
Don't worry.
while it
Just
was
one
afloat.
fish for. Yeah.
These ships
And then
are
I need to
fantastically
have
well built.
papaya
And
and
we call them
pineapple
dragon ships.
as
Uh,
dessert.
They can sail
Fruit
at
plates.
13 knots.
Yeah.
They're clinker built. They have that
No,
smooth.
just green tea, huh? Yeah,
There's a
thank you.
single mast with one big square sail. And the holes down the side, they're for the oars. Now, although those ships are quite large, the draft, how far it goes down in the water, isn't very much. So the ship is suitable to go on both rivers and the sea. And this is how that ship looked when they removed the earth when it was discovered in 1904. That's 1100 years after it was buried. The Gokstad ship was the largest one recovered. And Vikings have recently been credited with creating tar from pine tree roots, and that was used to seal and preserve them. They're built with those planks of oak, and it's cut while the wood is green, nailed together, and that ship is extremely strong. Look at that streamlined shape. It's easy to row. It's so much better than any other ship being built then. Not only were they practical, they took pride in doing intricate carvings on them. They're works of art. Now the Nor is their merchant ship, but it was built in the same way. It's just broader in the beam. Speed wasn't necessary here. You just had to carry the cargo, and they could carry up to 60 tons in that ship. And then for use in the fjords, they built these much smaller boats. They were living by the water's edge in the wonderful fjords. They used them to fish and to access the many small fields you'll find dotted along the water's edge. What a place to live. Now we move on 100 years, and they've settled now in the red parts that you can see. Now the Vikings stay over winter, and they settle in those lands, but only after a bit of a battle sometimes. Dublin was settled by the Norwegian Vikings in 801 AD. They'd been earlier raiding them, but that became the centre of the slave trade, driven probably by the price of slaves in Istanbul, and it was local people from Ireland and Britain that they took. And this is how Princess would operate their Viking tours in these foreign lands, a tour with some free time afterwards. And you could use that time for some pillaging, and then it's back to the ship for a Zumba class to finish off a wonderful day on a cruise. This is a replica Viking longship that I photographed in the Shetland Islands. It's another of the areas that the Norwegian Vikings colonised. And it was in 865 AD, after many smaller raids, that 3,000 Danish Vikings invaded England. They're what we called the Great Heathen Army, and suddenly they're conquerors. They captured East Anglia and Mercia and most of Northumbria. But King Alfred's Wessex repelled them, and they came to a peace agreement in 878, and they set up something known as Danelaw, which you can see down the centre there. Jorvik or York was their capital, and there the two cultures integrated and thrived. The legacy of that invasion can be seen in both the English language and in place names. There's over 1,000 Old Norse words which became part of standard English. For example, Stormbjordi was a Viking term for the steering board, and that in time changed to steerboard and is the origins of starboard. There were more than 1,500 Scandinavian place names in England, mainly in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. There's over 600 places end with the letters BY after them. That's a Scandinavian term for town, like Grimsby. And others are Thorpe for a farm and Thwaite, which is a clearing. Now let's continue with the 9th century. And we're going to move up the coast a bit, up to Lofoten. We're going there. Lovely, beautiful place. Now up until now their journeys have been coast hopping. They've just been going along down a bit. But there are new factors that have come along that enable them to do those long sea journeys. It's navigation and food that are significant obstacles to doing that. And here at Lofoten, they discover the cod and they learn how to dry it on the stocks. And stockfish is a very lightweight, highly nutritious food, and it's ideal for those long journeys. And at the end of the Viking bit, I'll tell you something about the stockfish, which hopefully you will see when we get up there. But let's look at navigation. And you will know that if you look at a sundial, the central post, using the shadow, will tell you the time of day. But it's possible to use that in reverse. If you can see where the sun rises and sun sets, you can actually work out a sun compass. And that makes travelling east and west relatively easy. And then in 1948, this fragment of a wooden disc with these compass markings around the edge was found in Greenland and is thought to be a Viking sun compass. And the final piece of the puzzle is navigating on a cloudy day when you can't see the sun. And in 2013, something called a calcite crystal was found in a 16th century Spanish warship. We now know that this polarizes the light, and you can use it even though it's cloudy to get a good idea of where the sun is in a cloudy day. And so there we have it, a Viking navigation kit that works at day, and of course in the night you can use the stars. There's the plough, which tells us where north is. You may also see in the local shops something called the Vegvisir. That's the runic compass, or Viking compass. It's marked around there with 8 Viking staves, and it's a symbol of protection and guidance. The word Vegvisir means wayfinder or signpost. Mind you, sometimes I'm not sure that they would really know exactly where they were. So we would stop and ask, wouldn't we? You go and see the locals, say we're getting lost. Yes, I'm nothing against the Scottish. Now, the Icelandic sagas tell us that the Norwegian Ravna Floki discovered Iceland, and he used a raven to find there. Birds can be good indicators of land. But it was the oppressive rule of Harald Fairhair in Norway that caused mass migration to Iceland. And this monument was erected near to Stavanger in 1983 to celebrate the Battle of Hafrsfjord. And its design is based on this Viking sword like the one found in the grave of a man called the Mountain Viking. Harald Fairhair defeated the local Viking chiefs in what is the largest known Viking battle to take place at sea. He is considered the father of Norwegian independence, That's according to the sagas, and he reigned for 60 years. His base was near to Haugesund, where we're going tomorrow, and there is this national monument, which was erected in 1872 as a focus towards Norwegian independence, which they only actually achieved in 1905, something they longed for. So now let's move on another century, the 10th century. That's the orange bits. And they go down the rivers, down to Eastern Europe, and to the west, Eric the Red, who found and settled Greenland. He'd been expelled from Iceland for being, a bit naughty. This was a Viennese view, as his 25 ships sailed into this strange land towards Narsarsuaq, where he first settled. It must have looked just like Norway, and in fact the population there will grow to 2,500, so it's quite a good settlement. Eric had been expelled by something called the local Ting, and that was established in 930 AD. The Norse word Ting translates to an assembly, and because no one wanted to be king of Iceland, that was how they governed the land. And today it's called Tingvair, and I guess some of you may have been there. This was the very first parliament, and the scenery is lovely. It's well worth a visit, and the only place on land where you can see two continental plates meet. The rest are underwater. But primarily it was a parliament. It was also used for religious activity and trade, and you can still see the remains of the booths there. And whilst that was the very first site, there were many other places that were used by the Vikings as parliaments. You can see them all listed there. So, we've got much to thank the Vikings for, or have we? So we move on to the 11th century, and it's the yellow bits now. You can see how far they've gone. We've gone to Finland in North America. 500 years before Columbus, more of England, and parts of the Mediterranean in Italy down there, North Africa. Some ships heading for Greenland missed. Navigation wasn't that good, and they carried on until they reached North America at Lance O'Meadows. There were never more than 160 Vikings there, and that settlement only lasted for a few years. That was because there was conflict with the local people and no support from Greenland. But it is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's got a replica along there. Now Viking history gets a bit complicated, and first I'm going to just show you what's going on in Britain. Danelaw had ended when Edred defeated Eric Bloodaxe in 954, but the settled Vikings of course remained. And then England experienced a period of peace for 60 years, growing economy, people getting richer. Meanwhile, over in Scandinavia, power struggles have been going on, and this results in the establishment of the Danish Jelling dynasty. Harald Bluetooth is now King of Denmark, and the red area in the middle is the bit under his direct control. And the yellow bits, the light yellow bits that you can see, they're submissive. They answer to him. And these are the two monuments in memory of his father and mother. And the writing on there says that Harald won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and he made his subjects Christian. But in fact that's only for the red areas. And that stone there, that's what the one on the left would have looked like when it was new. And it shows Christ escaping from pagan bonds as Christ starts to get at the Vikings. And that image is in every Danish passport. Most striking monument to the Jelling dynasty are these ring fortresses at Trelleborg. And all that is left now are these earth walls, but they're huge. And they had wooden fences on top, 4 longhouses, and room for 500 warriors. Now Harold Bluetooth's Danish successor was Sweyn Forkbeard, and he was more Viking than Christian. Then he developed new Viking methods of threat and extortion. He started raiding England, demanding money. Now, by this time, Ethelred the Unready is King of England. And he paid them £200,000 because of that extortion. And he got a bit fed up. So he ordered something called the St. Brice's Day Massacre in 1002. And a number of Vikings were massacred. And in response to that, Sweyn invaded and defeated Ethelred. But unlucky for him, Sweyn died 41 days after winning, so Ethelred got his crown back. And in the summer of 1015, Canute, who was Sweyn's Danish successor, sailed with an army of 200 ships and 10,000 men. And after many battles, Ethelred was defeated, and so in 1016, Canute became King of England. Now the territory held by the Viking Canute is this new Commonwealth. He was very successful. Now most of us only remember him because we think he tried to stop the water coming in. It's a myth. He was demonstrating that he was simply human and that only God could stop the water. Now back in Norway, Olaf Haraldsson, he's taken over as king in 1015, but it's still part of that Commonwealth. And he's significant because he's passionate about Norwegian independence and he claims to be a Christian. In 1028 he's killed at the Battle of Stiklestad, but then the Pope confirmed him as Saint Olaf in 1164, and that led to the widespread adoption of the Christian religion in Norway. His remains are enshrined in Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, and it was built over his burial site. But in reality, he was quite a brute. He was more Viking than Christian. He used religion as a tool to get more power for himself. And we move to this lovely church in Ålesund, where you'll find a stained glass picture window of him over the altar. Norwegians are very proud of him, so please don't tell them it was me that told you he's a brute. Now in England, Edward the Confessor established the House of Wessex in 1042, after a period of rule by two of Canute's sons. Then in 1066 he died, and Harald Hardrada, who was now King of Norway, invaded England with 300 longships and 10,000 men. He was quite successful at first, but shortly after he's defeated and he's killed by Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. That is the end of the Viking period. But shortly after this, Harold Godwinson was also defeated at the Battle of Hastings with the arrow in the eye. And of course that was the last successful invasion of England. But the Norwegians did try again in 1069, 1098 and 1102, but they failed. And so we have actually skimmed through a brief history of the Viking period. And we're going to look now at why they failed, what went wrong. That Viking culture I talked about at the start, it offered an afterlife of fighting during the day and feasting in the buffet at night. That's provided you had a reputation created for yourself that people would talk about you. But Christianity started to creep in about 800 AD. The problem with Viking culture that it was no longer viable. Christianity offered an afterlife for hell and damnation for killing. That's not what a Viking wanted. And also being a Christian gave you safety from other Christian countries, but you had to join the club. Another significant factor was the adding of higher sides to European ships, like this one called the King, and that led to the carrack, it's got even higher sides. And now archers could shoot down into the relatively low longships. the Vikings are no longer masters of the seas. But I'd also like to look at their raiding and trading, because many of you might think they simply took what they wanted. The green on the map here, that shows you where else they went, either raiding or trading. This is a classic image that simply reinforces that they're raiders and nothing else. It's another myth. Viking society was well developed, land was owned, there were taxes and laws, there was the ultimate threat of being sent into exile. And the truth was, only 2 to 5% of what they did involved raiding. As they visited all those green areas, it was really peaceful trade they wanted. It was much more important to them. They traded goods from the north, like amber, furs and slaves, for silver. And the kneeling Viking that you can see in the middle there, he's using some silver scales to do the trade. He's checking the value. In fact, the Vikings were very clever, because when they got somewhere new, they'd go and have a look, see how well defended it was. And if it's defended, they would trade. Then Christianity comes along, and they're happy to adopt Christ or Thor. Thor's hammer initially looked like the one on the left, but it changed over time to the one on the right. Left hanging like that, it's still Thor's hammer. When they found Christians, they just turn it over and become a Christian. We have evidence that they traded far and wide. In the Stockholm Museum, these 3 items were found very close to each other. That one is a bishop's crozier from the west, from Ireland. The bottom one is a Coptic ladle from Egypt to the south. And there is a bronze Buddha from Pakistan to the east. Their fingers went far and wide. Now another point I need to clarify is who did what to who when they stepped ashore from these wonderful ships, plundering or trading. And if you go ashore and you ask a Norwegian, why did you attack Britain? The chances are they will say to you, we didn't do those terrible and fearsome things. And they may be right. Because this other map, it's got 3 colours on it, and it shows the areas that each of the 3 Viking nations conquered and went to. And there's green for Norwegian and blue for Danish. And if you move in close to the English bit, you can see that both of them attacked us. So they may be right. Now I'd like to deal with a couple of other myths. There's a Viking word in English called berserk. And in Viking tradition, a berserker is a warrior of great strength, fought with ferocity, screamed loudly. The word comes from bear sark, which is a bear coat, and they certainly existed. And they were probably in a state of trance, but there is no truth in the rumour that they ate funny mushrooms. And there's some fearsome Vikings setting off on a raid, and those horns that create a really powerful image. And it's another picture painted in 1908 by Mary McGregor, and she shows Leif Erikson landing at Vinland, and she included horns. Now these are 2 real Viking helmets. There are no horns. It's a myth. It started in the 1800s. There was a faulty translation of a runestone, and it mentioned in it horns and the head. What the stone actually said when they worked it out properly was horns were used for drinking. That's a drinking cup, and they came from the top of the head. Now let's look at some Viking celebrations. They have a number of festivals, including the winter solstice, which is the return of the sun. They call it the Yule Festival. We can actually relate this to parts of Christmas. Their Yule tree may have inspired our Christmas tree. they would have an evergreen fir tree and decorate it with small statues of the gods, put food and clothes on it, because they're calling to the spirits of the forest. They revered the forest. The Yule goat is another important part of the festival. Now Thor, the god of thunder and lightning, used a pair of goats to pull his chariot through the sky, making the sound of thunder. And one Viking would ride into the home on a Yule goat, dressed as the Old Man of Winter, and join them in the feast. Is he their Santa Claus? And this is the Osserberg ship, being excavated in 1904. It is the finest artefact from that time, and buried for all those years. But for me, there is one word that conjures all we've seen so far, and that's Viking, as I get to the end of the Viking story. But remember, I now want to tell you the stockfish story, because that was so important to them for their travels. And the Norwegian sentence you see down there translates to, it's so lovely that you want to learn more about cod and stockfish. There is actually a lot to learn about that one fish. They've got a number of names, some surprising places where it's sold, child education, and a link to the coastal ferry, the Hurtigruten. Two types of cod. There is cod torsk, that's the coastal cod that stays on the coastal waters all year. Then there is cod scray, and that comes down to Lofoten area to spawn. That's the one they prefer to use for this fish. And there are two preservation methods, stockfish and clipfish. Now the young cod lives way up north, and it's there for 4 years, and it starts in the striped area, and then it moves to the light blue, and then the dark blue. Now the orange areas you can see down the bottom there, which are mainly around Lofoten, are the spawning grounds, and here the water temperature and the salinity are perfect for spawning. And it only lasts for a short time, and all the fishing boats gather together from up and down the coast to collect this short harvest. They're going to live in primitive basic accommodation, and this one's called a råbur, a fishing lodge, and this is one picture that's Svalbard. It is that warm Gulf Stream that creates the ideal conditions, not only for the cod to spawn, but also the right weather conditions for the fish to just dry when it's hung out. In Burda, at the harbour entrance, we can see the racks ready for the prepared fish. They're going to be hung on them. You will see them somewhere, I'm sure. They're the stocks. The fish heads are removed, the body gutted, and they take 2 fish, tie them together and hand them on the stock. They then hang out in the open from February to May. There's no other ingredients necessary, and luckily quite a few of the seabirds have left. And the wind and the weather from the north, from the Gulf Stream, will take their body weight down and remove 75% of its weight to take away all the moisture, but it loses none of its nourishment. That's why it's so important to the Vikings. It's dried and brought inside and stacked, but it's now rock hard. You can, though, with a hammer, shatter it into little pieces. And many Norwegians will buy this snack. They're like crisp packets. In fact, my wife will be buying some this trip, I'm sure. But it'll need to be triple wrapped in plastic before I bring it on board and put it anywhere near the suitcase. And when we get home, she'll have to eat it outside on the balcony. Sometimes you'll see it called lutefisk. That's just to confuse you. That's simply stockfish that has been rehydrated, and it looks quite appealing, doesn't it? The biggest export for them is Italy and Nigeria. It now seems strange that Italy buys that stockfish, but for many years that was Norway's largest export. In the summer of 1431, this Venetian merchant, he went to Bruges. He had 3 ships full of wine and spices. But there was appalling weather on the north coast there, and they got blown north. And then they had to abandon ship into the lifeboats. In January of the next year, they landed in the Lofoten Islands, and the locals took them in. He returned 3 months later with a load of stockfish. You know, they've been eating it ever since. And then, of course, Nigeria. They had a civil war, and the United Nations wanted help for their food. So Norway sent stockfish as a practical form. It's very easy to store, it's very nutritious, and they love it. Now, clipfish is different, and it's a more recent way of preserving it. It was developed when salt became cheaper, and the fish is coated with that. Then the cod is laid out to dry for 3 to 4 weeks. It's quicker, and it is traditional work for women and children then. Today, it's manufactured in a factory on wooden racking and dried in big ovens. The biggest market for clipfish is Portugal. Most clipfish is used to make something called bacalhau. That's a Mediterranean type of fish stew. And actually I quite like that, although I prefer red meat. Now, none of the fish is wasted, and school children volunteer for the work of taking out the tongues out of the head, which is another delicacy. It teaches them that work is good, and it's good for their mental arithmetic. In Norway, children are allowed to earn 5,000 kroner a year, tax-free. So they'll be working away, adding it up in their head. As soon as they get to 5,000, they down tools. And in the olden days, Norwegian children had to have a daily spoonful of the cod liver oil. They were told it was good for them. And then there's the Hurtigruten, the local bus service from Norway, from Bergen to the north of Norway, or the bus service to the locals. After World War II, 4 of their ships had been lost, and they needed to replace them, and they were short of foreign currency. The government asked the Italians, would they accept clipfish